All right, so the last session of the day, or days, I should say. We know we've had 30 minutes on the clock here, but I know Sophia has a plane to catch. So we're going to be concise, we're going to be insightful, and the rest of us are going to go off for cocktails after and talk about what you told us that was so insightful. Maybe just give us a little bit of an introduction first. I mean, Sophia, about what the Gensler Research Institute, I think we're all familiar with Gensler. What is Gensler Research Institute?
Yeah, so most people are familiar with Gensler, but a lot of people don't know that we have a research arm, and it's called the Gensler Research Institute. Gensler has, part of their ethos is really to improve human experience through the power of design. And so in order to do that, we need to understand human experience, and that's why the Gensler Research Institute was started. And it started with workplace, because that was our oldest and largest body of work. And the questions we were asking is, how do you design workspaces so that people are happier, people are more productive, people want to stay with these companies? So I lead cities research, and we apply the same kinds of questions to cities. How can we design cities better so that people are happier, people want to come to the city, people want to stay in the city? So that's what we do for cities research.
Great, thanks. Antonio, tell us briefly about DIALOG as the chairman. What does that involve?
Sure, so Antonio Gomez Palacio. DIALOG, and I'm really glad to see a lot of familiar faces here in the room, because we actually work and collaborate with many of you. But we walk this kind of funny line between being extreme idealists and pragmatists. We truly believe that through what we do, design of the built environment, we can meaningfully improve the well-being of communities. But because of our practice, architects, engineers, urban planners, interior designers, landscape architects, we're in the messiness of it, and we're always trying to make things happen. So it's a world that I am very excited to get up early in the mornings, and when we're lucky, we can see it actually having an impact.
Great. So you guys are doing the hard work at Gensler, DIALOG. At Resonance, we're much more focused on research, strategy, place marketing, placemaking of cities. We do our own index, now going on 11 years, World's Best Cities Report. And part of that, as we've developed that over the last decade, concerned of having a bit of a Western bias, because we're looking at the factors that attract talent, attract visitors, attract investment to cities. To negate some of that, we decided we would partner with Ipsos, do a global survey, ask people, what do you see as the most desirable cities to live in, to visit? Where do you think the best job opportunities are? And we ran the second edition of that this year, and I was struck by how many cities were exactly the cities that you would expect, the so-called global cities. So everybody in the United States wants to live in New York if they could. Everybody in Europe said they would live in Paris or London. And then even in Asia, actually, you saw basically everybody in Asia wants to live in Singapore. I don't know if that's because Michael Coe is they're doing such a good job with the Center of Livable Cities, but 1 in 3 people in all of the Asian countries in aggregate together that we surveyed said they would live in Singapore. Tokyo was second. So it kind of struck me that these global cities, or what Saskia Saskin kind of coined this idea about the global city, these tentpole cities that would attract talent, capital, that seemed to also resonate with the general public. But our survey is very superficial, just asking that question. I'm curious, Sophia, as you've gone into your index and the work that you've been doing since the start of the pandemic, tell us a little bit about what that involves and the kinds of questions you're asking and some of the insights that are coming out of that.
Yeah, so since the pandemic shut down, we started doing a city pulse. And that was really initially to gauge the impact of the pandemic on cities. And we started with a very modest 4 cities. It was New York, Singapore, London, San Francisco. And we were examining questions like satisfaction, move intentions. And when we realized that the pandemic wasn't ending in 3 months, we kept expanding cities. So now our most recent report, which we released a few months ago, covered 65 cities in 6 global regions, 30 different countries, 21 different languages. And we also collected data for the business districts. So we have data for 125 different business districts. And since the inception of City Pulse, we've connected with over 150,000 people all over the world. And they were all demographically diverse by age, by gender, by education, by income level, so that we're really getting a representative sample of each city. The most recent report focused on what makes a city magnetic, right? And what we found was that what draws people to cities is quite different than what gets them to stay. What brings people to cities, we found, was that people are in search for security, right? Think Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're looking for physical security, safety from crime, access to high quality healthcare. But you're also thinking about financial security, like job opportunities, career advancement, cost of living concerns. So those are the more tangible aspects that get people drawn to cities. But what gets them to stay, and it's important to understand what gets them to stay, because cities they cannot grow from the natural birth rate alone. So they're really reliant on attracting people to cities and retaining them. So to retain residents, it's all about emotional connection. It's about that sense of pride, engaging people, increasing that sense of belonging. The ability to seeing yourself age in the city. And we've heard so much, even today and yesterday, like Janet with Downtown Van, talking about all the programming that they did, and she kept saying, and we were so proud of it, right? And so when you have that pride, it actually roots you in the city. But we also look at what creates a great experience in a city. And what we found was that it's actually very different, across regions and individual cities, in fact. It's like the same things aren't as important, for different cities. For example, New York. New York culture, entertainment, shopping, as well as diversity, those are the biggest drivers of a great experience in New York. But in Monterrey, Mexico, it's about job opportunities and career advancement and financial security. And in Vancouver, the most important driver for Vancouver is the urban environment, and that's things like, air quality, noise quality, the vibrancy, the energy of a city, the attractiveness of a city, the ability to rest and relax and recharge. So that urban environment is actually very important for Vancouver, and it's definitely not affordability or cost of living.
Oh, I thought it was just how well the Canucks were doing from year to year. That's a much more nuanced explanation. So you have these regional variations from place to place. I want to come back to that, but maybe Antonio, talk a little bit about sort of what you see as sort of the role, responsibility of cities now, and what those variations are maybe from one part of the world to another.
Sure. So I've always felt that cities in many regard are a representation of ourselves. But almost more importantly, they're a representation of our aspirations, of our dreams, of what we hope that society can be. And I know, Chris, Sophia, we kind of met in advance of all of this, but what we didn't know at that time was everything that was going to transpire over the course of the last 3 days. So ours being a little bit of a closing session, we get a little bit of an opportunity to also draw upon everything that has happened in the last 3 days through World City. And something that has struck me, and I'll say it first facetiously and then seriously. So facetiously, kind of as a conclusion, having seen people talk about climate and talk about culture and talk about society, clearly we have to do it all. But clearly we have to do it all. Because we are not going to achieve the economic development of Monterrey in Mexico, if you describe, or many of these other cities, if we're not leveling up society and doing that. And we're not going to achieve that if we lose the environment, if we're eroding the environment around it. So in fact, everything that you heard over the last 3 days, it's imperative that we do it all, and we do it simultaneously. And we really use the most complex machinery we have ever invented, which is cities, right? Urbanism and the construction of cities is this incredible tool at our disposal to either completely wreck it or to build the aspiration, the society that we truly believe that we can be. So let's pour our hearts and our hopes and aspirations and do it all simultaneously, because only if we're doing it concurrently is it actually going to be able to achieve every individual piece.
Yeah, doing it all concurrently is, something that we've talked a lot about, like how do you kind of breaking down those silos, and we framed it as thinking about the livability, the lovability, and the prosperity of place all at the same time, and that you couldn't have one without the other, and they're all interconnected. Sophia, I'm curious, so kind of your perspective of having started this research in the pandemic and growing it. Obviously, we don't have the pre-pandemic sort of as a baseline, but are there some trends or shifts or things that you've seen coming out in the data as you've been doing these surveys and it's been growing around the world?
So in terms of like living preferences, for example, coming out of the pandemic, there was a desire for a smaller city vibe. People wanted more, they didn't want to, and I think it was a product of the pandemic. They didn't want these like huge, they didn't want to live in huge, dense cities. They still wanted that urban environment, but it was really more about, neighborhoods and walkable cities and being able to, have a shorter commute to work and and have access to all the residential amenities, like a 15-minute city. That really came out very clearly in our, in our data. But then also the importance of being able to work remotely, maybe not 5 days a week, but just being able to have that flexibility was so important for people. Now that they had that taste of having time back from their commute.
And when you talk about those sort of the shifts, is that globally, or do you see that more specifically in the US, Canada, Western countries?
Yeah, it actually varies by country even, and even in the U.S., right? It's the South is definitely much more back to they're back to the office, but they want much more space and less inclined to be in denser areas.
So there are these regional variations, both in values, aspirations, behavior. When our framework, when we're putting together a world's best cities ranking, we're probably sort of guilty of propagating this idea about an ideal city by putting the same metrics, the same framework across all of these cities. I'm curious, Antonio, from your perspective, do we need to think about cities more or in different ways, different segments from different places? I mean, you've just come back from Mexico, meeting with the president and business leaders there. I mean, what's the frame of the conversation about cities there versus here in Vancouver versus maybe other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. To a certain extent, I think the problems are shared, right? And the problems that we're facing are quite global, but the solutions need to be bespoke, right? How we embrace climate, society, all of these other aspects will always need to not only be a very tailored solution, but it inherently has to include the community, the participation of actors within those communities. So I have to say that, what is relevant here, and Andrea today challenged us on looking at the vulnerable communities within Vancouver, and that's been an incredibly hard conversation to have over many decades, and it will. If there's anything that we're going to make progress, it's going to have to be by including people in that in moving forward. So how different cities embrace it, I find have always created opportunities for us to learn from each other, for opportunities for us to be inspired. But at the end of the day, it's only getting us to better questions, not to prescribed solutions.
So I like that framework about thinking about that we have kind of common challenges. And certainly we all had the same challenge in COVID, and there was maybe common solutions at that point, but now needing to maybe shift our thinking that it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, that we do need bespoke solutions from one place to another. As you think, Sophia, in your research, as you look at the aspirations, intentions, I mean, now you're focusing on a study on central business districts and attitudes towards the city centers, which I think is maybe kind of the lasting legacy coming out of that pandemic, and the change is that for the most part, the way we use cities, live in the cities, went back more or less the same, other than our city centers, which still are very different, and they're very different from one place to another. As you kind of go out and do that research, I mean, what have you already found out, or what do you think some of the things or insights are, attitudes towards city centers from one part of the world to another? Because it feels quite different in Asia than it does in Canada, than it does in Europe.
Absolutely. So, I mean, definitely during the pandemic, anything that was mono-use, mono-purpose, were the least resilient. And anything that was mixed use, we found that the more mixed use it was, the more residents you had, the greater the satisfaction for a downtown district. And so, and the likelihood, and if you're satisfied with your business district, there's an 80% likelihood that you are actually having a great experience in your city. So that's why that central core is so important to the city as a whole. But what we found, when I'm thinking about global cities, right, we often think of it as like hubs of, capital, of culture and talent. But what we're finding with our research is thinking of it differently. Well, what if instead you're focused on human experience? And really the barometer of measuring the success of a city is really about how well they can deliver that experience for the residents. And it will be bespoke, right? Because the cities that are going to do well are the ones that actually excel at what matters to the people who live there. And so I think, like, if we could shift that, the way we measure cities, I think it could actually be very transformational for a lot of places.
And those aspirations are probably driven by what? Differences in shared values from one community to another?
Shared values or different priorities. Like, for example, in LATAM, safety is such a huge concern, much more so than Middle East or in Asia. And you heard Jana from Downtown Van speak this morning about making sure that people feel safe. Well, safety is such a huge factor in a great experience worldwide, right? But it's so much more important in the places where you don't have it, right? And we saw in East Asia, for example, safety was not an important factor. Because why? It's because they already feel very safe. And it varies also by demographic, by gender. And you can, not surprisingly guess that women, many more women don't feel as safe as men. And we've heard it, in the last few days about women, children, and elderly, right, or seniors. And I love William Hawley White, so the social life of small urban spaces. And he talks about the most successful public spaces are the ones where you see women, children, and elderly there. I don't know why I went on that tangent, but...
And Chris, I know you have some questions lined up, but if I can pile up there, because you mentioned I was in Mexico yesterday, and one of the interesting things that they've done is they've said, okay, we've got an economic imperative, and we've got a social imperative, and we've got a environmental imperative. So let's start mapping the things that we really care about on these different fronts, and they went through this exercise. But then where it got really fascinating is they overlaid these maps, right? And they looked at the overlapping vulnerabilities, right? Those critical areas. So all of a sudden, it became abundantly clear where the priority zones, where the areas of intervention, because it meant that intervening in this one particular spot, and they identified 26 spots across the entire country, would have the greatest impact on all the triple bottom line. And when they got really nuanced, and then the solutions being completely different, it meant that they needed to focus on really poignant elements. So the microeconomy that would create resilience in the supply chains. A very nuanced conversation, but a really, really important one. Building circularity with waste, because that was not only a huge concern from an environmental perspective, it became an economic development for low-income communities. And this exercise led to a whole series of very poignant interventions. And I'm reminded in where you were heading, one of them is they declared this year the Year of Indigenous Women and focused a tremendous amount of attention, again, to those areas that required the most intersectional kind of interventions. It's fascinating.
So it strikes me as you think about, and I'm curious as a planner, if the framework is probably the same, if you're looking at the economic, environmental, social, the economics, we all work with different analysts that come on board, do this feasibility studies, et cetera. We understand those models. The environmental, we have a lot of common ambitions in terms of the goals we're trying to meet. Climate change is universal, but the values are different, so the social metrics probably need to be different from one project to another.
I'll give you now a more local example. We got hired by the City of Toronto to do their thermal comfort design guidelines. This is recognizing that the city will be experiencing from 15 to 50 days of extreme heat. And we said, great, we'll do that, but if we can bring an equity lens. So we did that overlying mapping, and we mapped now vulnerabilities, social vulnerabilities with the extreme heat environments. And what it gave us was the priority zones, right? Those areas where you could now start to see that not only people had a low tree canopy to create shade, but it was near a senior's home or a low-income neighborhood or a bus stop. It was places that really, really required it. So all of a sudden you can guide resources, guide investments to those places that are going to have the biggest impact.
I love that, because it's actually one of the responsibilities of a city, right, which is to provide equity, right, to ensure, because like regardless of all the capital and talent and industry that comes to a city, it's the responsibility of a city to make sure that that urban life works for everybody, right? So I actually love that.
Sorry, Chris, we're going off script for you.
I'm sorry.
All right. So as we think, we're supposed to be, as we think about talking about the world's next cities, what defines success, or how should we be framing that as you think about all of the different components, economic, environmental, social, different values from place to place? What do you think the cities of the future that we'll be looking at? We talk about the Copenhagen's or Vancouver's today. What are the cities of the future? Why will we be talking about them? What will they have done in the next 10 years that we'll be saying 10 years from now, we should be talking about these cities at World City?
Well, for me, it all comes out of, our magnetic city research, and it's really about how people feel, that emotional connection to the cities, the sense of belonging, the sense of pride in your city. Because why does that matter? Because pride keeps you rooted in the city. Belonging is so much tied to social trust. When you have joy, it makes, staying that's in your city, through the hard times a lot easier. And so when you can look at cities through that lens of human experience, it could actually be very transformational. And I'm reminded of what's been going on with Detroit, for example. Detroit, decades of urban decline, the poster child of urban decline. They lost population, they lost jobs. Thousands of homes were vacant. And at one point, like, half the streetlights in the city weren't working at all. But in the last 10, 15 years, I want to say, they had this incredible transformation. And the former mayor, Mike Dugan, he implemented all these programs to increase pride, right? And it was providing incentives for home ownership. It was cleaning up the yards so that it looked like people cared about these areas. And that what ended up happening was he called it the pride came back. And so, like, there was the emotional reconnection with the city was just as critical as the financial recovery. But the pride coming back is what made the revival stick, right? Because when you have pride in your city, you become the strongest evangelist for your city. And you stop talking about leaving, and you start talking about actually investing your life there. So I feel like when you look at the emotional connections, it's going to be just as powerful of an indicator as as the GDP or the unemployment rate or housing prices.
Well, you should come and pitch for us for all of our clients at Resonance and explain that to them of the value of what we call civic identity, right? Which is, I think, for us, one of the things that defines success is pride of place for the people that live there. Antonio, what do you think defines success for the next cities?
So I'll get dystopian and then I'll become utopian. If we screw it all up, right? If we screw climate, if we screw all of these things up, humanity will survive. The problem is the impact will be extremely unequal. Vast amounts of people will suffer incredibly. So it's not the big issue is the inequality of it, right? The extreme polarization around it. So now if you're asking, so what is it that we're aiming? Well, it's actually to reduce or eliminate that extreme polarization. So the great cities of the future have to work for everybody. It can't just work for a few people. So we really need to be focusing on that leveling it out. Now the good news is cities are never finished. You're never done. The best cities in the world, if you look around, they're still trying to figure things out. They're reinventing themselves. So therefore, it's not just about the outcomes that you're achieving, it's about the empowerment along the way. It's about setting the conditions up so that the next generation can continue to plan their city, so that the next and the next and the next generation can take this 1,000-year-old project that is going to be city building and make it their own and embrace the challenges of their own time.
So speaking about that sort of utopian, dystopian points of view, how are you feeling today? More optimistic, less optimistic about the future of cities moving forward?
Oh, I've always been bullish on cities, always. Even when New York Post came out with the headline, New York is dead forever during the pandemic, hogwash. So I'm always bullish on cities.
I don't think we could be in this profession if we weren't optimistic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If we didn't think that.
Right.
And in fact, the job is to imagine that the world could be better and then to work really, really hard to make that happen.
Right.
But I'd like the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, who was asked that question, and he said, well, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I'm dedicated. I'm just like focused on getting things moving forward.
Well, I think that's maybe the one thing that characterizes both of you and everyone in the room that's in part of World City is that we're both dreamers and realists, like having one foot grounded, understanding the challenges that we have, but not so grounded that we're not able to dream and think about alternative futures and possibilities for the places and communities that we work in. So I want to thank you both so much for being here today. We probably could have gone another half hour we'll continue conversations over drinks. I know, Sophia, you have to grab a flight. I want to give a warm round of applause, please, to welcome Sophia and Antonio.
And Chris, if I may, thank you. You're not only moderating us, but you're helping organize along with Jasmine and everybody else. It was a wonderful event, and giving it the closing.
Thanks. Yeah, on that note, want to thank everyone that's here, that stuck through to the end. All of these talks are being recorded. So again, you're the studio audience. These will be shared online in the weeks to come, so you can feel free to share things, insights, playback, and that's really part of what the global community of World City is all about. I want to make sure and thank Jasmine. As you pointed out, World City wouldn't be possible without Jasmine. And most importantly, World City wouldn't be possible without all of you. So we've taken a couple group photos. We want to do one more. We want to invite all of you to come down to the stage, and we're going to do one photo, and then we will be moving back over to the World City Lounge for drinks. So thanks, everyone. Come on down, and let's take a family photo.